Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Fond Lady of Burton Agnes. Burton Agnes is a famous Yorkshire house of which many ghostly stories have been told, particularly in connection with the Screaming Skull. A following short tale was sent to Lord Halifax in 1915 by Mrs. Wickham Boynton, the owner. Mrs. Lane Fox tells me that you were interested to hear I had seen the ghost here last month and that you would like to know more about it. We were having tea in the hall when I looked up suddenly and saw a small, thin woman dressed in fawn color come out of the garden, walk very quickly up the steps, and disappear through the front door, which I thought was open into the house. I imagined it must be the parson's wife, and remarked to my husband, who had seen nothing, "There is Mrs. Courts. Go and bring her in." He went out at once, but presently came back to say that there was no one there and that the front door was shut. Then I remembered the old story of a fond lady who had been seen about the place. Oddly enough, the last time she appeared, many years ago, she was also hurrying up steps into the house, but they were the steps on the east front. My father saw her and followed her inside, but she had vanished. She is probably the Griffith ancestress, AD 1620, whose skull is still in the house here, though no one knows exactly where it is walled up. Her sister and heir married Sir Matthew Boynton, and so brought Burton Agnes into the family. Of course, I am told it was all imagination, but it was very curious. The Page Boy of Hayne. In 1885, when Lord Halifax was staying with his father-in-law at Powderham Castle, Devonshire, among the guests was a Lady Ferguson Davy, wife of Sir John Ferguson Davy of Creedy, who was old Lord Devon's nephew. One evening, when ghost stories were being told in the hall, Lady Davy made the following contribution. Some years ago, Mr. Harris of Hayne in Devon had a good deal of his plate stolen, and with the plate there disappeared a little page boy who had been for some time in his service. Although every effort was made, neither the plate nor the boy could be traced, and Mr. Harris was so much upset by the whole occurrence that he went away and was absent for a good long while. One night, shortly after his return home, he saw, or fancied he saw, the page boy standing at the foot of his bed. Supposing that he had been dreaming, or that his imagination had played him a trick, he turned over and went to sleep, scarcely giving the matter another thought. The next night he again saw, or fancied he saw, the same figure standing by his bedside, and again he took no notice. But when on the third night the page boy appeared once more, Mr. Harris got out of bed, and when the figure left the room he followed it. The boy moved down the passage and the stairs, always a little ahead of him, turning around constantly and beckoning to him, as though he were trying to lead him somewhere. At length he passed out of the house altogether, with Mr. Harris still following, and came to a wood close by. Here he disappeared at the foot of a very large hollow tree. Next day Mr. Harris had the tree cut down. Inside it were found the remains of the boy and a portion of the plate. The discovery led to the apprehension and confession of the butler, who admitted that he had made away with the plate little by little, as the opportunity offered, that he had hidden it in the hollow tree until he was able to dispose of it, and that finding that the page boy had discovered what was going on, he had murdered him, concealing the body in the tree with the plate. The Ghost of Lord Conyers Osborne. Under the date November 16th, 1884, Lord Halifax wrote in the Ghost Book: I was staying with the Reverend John Sharp on the occasion of his jubilee when the Bishop of Winchester, who was also there, told the following stories. George William Frederick, 6th Duke of Leeds, married Lady Charlotte Townshend, daughter of George, 1st Marquis Townshend. Their second son, Lord Conyers Osborne, who was of at Christ Church, was killed accidentally by Lord Downshire on May 6, 1812. The bishop had the story from Mrs. George Portal, whose aunt, Lady James Townshend, had married the brother of the Duchess of Leeds. Lady James had told Mrs. Portal that one evening she was sitting writing in her room when she saw Lord Conyers, wearing a dressing gown which he had embroidered for him, walk straight through. She rang the bell and asked the butler if Lord Conyers had come. The man replied that he had not, seeming surprised at the question and hinting that Lady James must have been asleep and dreaming. She, however, was so much impressed by what she thought she had seen that, before going to bed, she wrote to Lord James to tell him about it. Next day Lord Conyers' servant arrived from Oxford. He asked to see Lady James, and when he was shown into a room, told her that his young master had been killed wrestling with Lord Downshire at Christ Church. He begged her to break the news to the Duchess of Leeds, as he dared not do so himself. Years afterwards, when Lord James was dead, Mrs. Portal was reading over and tearing up old letters with her aunt, and in a bundle of them, which she was about to destroy, she found the letter to Lord James describing Lord Conyers' appearance. The ghost of Lady Carnarvon. The bishop, Lord Halifax, went on, also told us this story, on the authority either of Mrs. or Miss Portal, who lived close to Highclere, Lord Carnarvon's place in Hampshire. Some time ago, Lord Carnarvon's brother, the Honourable Alan Herbert, who was a doctor in Paris, was lying dangerously ill at Highclere. One day, when he was almost unconscious, the nurse saw a lady, dressed in black, into the room and draw back the curtains of the bed. She then nodded her head in a very peculiar way. The nurse did not know who the lady was, but supposed her to be some relation staying in the house. Some time afterwards, when Mr. Herbert was getting better, the housekeeper, showing the nurse over the house, took her into Lord Carnarvon's private sitting room. "Why," said the nurse, pointing to a picture over the chimney-piece, "there is the lady who came into the room and looked at Mr. Herbert." It was a portrait of Lady Carnarvon, Alan Herbert's mother, who had died some years before. She was dressed in black and had a peculiar way of nodding her head. The ghost of Bishop Wilberforce. This story seems to have been collected on the same occasion as the two preceding ones, and the narrator was probably Bishop Brown. The late Bishop of Winchester, Dr. Wilberforce, had often expressed a wish to see Wootton, Mr. Evelyn's place not far from Guildford. He was particularly interested in a portrait there of Mrs. Godolphin, whose life he had written in his early days. Somehow he had never been able to pay the visit, but on the occasion of his death he was riding with Lord Granville about 2 miles from Wootton. Mr. Evelyn, the doctor, and Mr. Harvey, and a brother of Mr. Evelyn's, were sitting in the dining room at Wootton, when one of the party exclaimed, "Why, there is the Bishop of Winchester looking in at the window." They all looked and saw a figure, which disappeared. They went out to see if the bishop was there, but there was nobody. Half an hour later a servant came in with the news of the bishop's death. He had been killed by a fall from his horse on his way to Holmbury, where Lord Granville was living. The ship in distress. On board a certain ship, the name of which I cannot recall, the words "steer to the northeast" were found one morning written on the slate log in the captain's cabin. No one on board would admit to having written the entry, which excited a good deal of wonder and speculation. The mate, however, said he had an idea that he had seen a strange man riding in the captain's cabin. Eventually the captain altered the course of the vessel and steered northeast as directed, with the result that later on in the day a waterlogged vessel with a starving crew was sighted. When the rescued sailors were taken aboard, the mate, looking at one of them, exclaimed, "That is the man I fancied I saw riding in the captain's cabin." The man in question was then asked to write the words "steer to the northeast" on a slate, without, however, being told the reason for the request. He did so, and the writing was found to be identical with that previously found on the log. On inquiry it transpired that this particular man had always been certain that he and his mates would be rescued. Early on the morning of the day on which they were picked up, he had fallen into a kind of trance, and on waking up, he had declared that he was more sure than ever that help was at hand. A similar story was that of a young midshipman who was drowned on his way home from a foreign station. He had brought a letter from the admiral on the station to his wife. Mr. Church, then vicar of Hickleton, capped his tale with the information that his grandmother had seen her husband walking in the garden in his uniform at the very moment when, as was subsequently discovered, he was killed on active service in India. The widow in the train. The Colonel Ewart mentioned in this story was very possibly the uncle of Mr. H. B. Ewart, an old friend of Lord Halifax. Mr. Ewart had some recollection of having heard the story from his uncle. A Colonel Ewart was travelling alone by express train from Carlisle to London. He went to sleep, and when he awoke found that a lady in black with a crape veil had entered his compartment and occupied one of the corner seats. As he had been asleep for some time, he supposed she must have entered rather quietly and apologized to her for being without his coat and his boots. The lady made no reply, and thinking she might be deaf and had not heard him, he crossed to the other side of the compartment and sat down in the seat opposite to her. But when he repeated his apology, she still did not answer, and seemed as though she did not hear him. He thought her conduct strange and was still wondering about it when there came a sudden crash. There had been a collision. Colonel Ewart was unhurt, and at once jumped out to see what had happened and if he could be of any use. Then, remembering the lonely lady in his compartment and wondering if she were frightened or injured, he went back. The carriage was empty. There was no trace of the lady anywhere, and the guard declared that the door had been locked, although the collision had forced it open, and that no one could possibly have come in since Carlisle, as the train had not stopped anywhere until the accident occurred. Later, Colonel Ewart learned that a few years before bride and bridegroom had been traveling on the same line and by a corresponding train. The man had put his head too far out of the window to look at something and had been caught by a wire, so that the headless body had fallen back into the carriage. At the next station the bride was found singing a lullaby over her husband's body. The shock had driven her quite mad. Killed in action. A certain clergyman had 3 sons. The eldest was serving in the Crimea, and the 2 younger ones who were at school had come home for the holidays. The boys slept in the same room, their beds, which were on opposite sides of it, facing each other foot to foot. The window of the room was close to the door and could be seen equally well from either bed. One night one of the boys woke up and saw the figure of his brother, then in the Crimea, kneeling at the window in an attitude of prayer. He called out to his sleeping brother, asking him if he could see anything, and he, waking up, replied, "Yes, I see Arthur kneeling at the window." As they spoke, the kneeling figure turned and gave them a sad and loving look. The boys were frightened and wondered how they could get out of the room without passing by the kneeling figure. At last they made a rush past the window, reached the door, roused their father, and told him what they had seen. He went up to their room, and finding nothing there, concluded they must have been dreaming. He told them, however, to say nothing to their mother of what they thought had appeared to them. 2 or 3 weeks later, news came from the Crimea of an attack upon the Sandbank battery, in which Arthur had been killed. One day after the end of the war, when the troops had come home, the family had a visit from the chaplain attached to the regiment in which Arthur had served. He told them that, though a stranger to them, he had felt so great an interest in their son that he was impelled to come and see them. He went on to say that on the night before the attack on the battery, their son and a few other officers had asked to be given Holy Communion, that Arthur was quite certain that he would be killed, and that while expressing no particular wish to live, he had said he would have liked to see his 2 brothers again. The Troubled Spirit of Tintern Alley. This story was privately printed in 1910 and sent to Lord Halifax, apparently by the author, who subscribed himself E.B. It was, I think, in the spring of 1895 that my wife and I went for a bicycling tour along the Wye. In due course we arrived at Tintern, where we proposed to stay for a couple of nights. After luncheon we inspected the ruins and paid them a second visit after dinner, as it was a delicious evening with brilliant moonlight. My wife has at times the power of writing automatically. She rarely exercises it, as she somewhat mistrusts herself and therefore prefers to leave these matters alone. However, that evening the beauty and mystery of the ruined abbey impelled me to ask her if she had any psychic feelings. She replied that she had. We sat down upon a block of masonry, and almost at once her right hand was controlled as it were by an invisible agency which made it rap repeatedly on her knee. She asked that the action should be moderated, and I suggested that if anyone wished to communicate with us, 3 taps should be given for yes and 1 for no. Her hand at once rose and fell 3 times, more gently than before, and we established communication by the tedious but usual process of going through the alphabet until a rep announced that the right letter had been reached. Many questions and answers resulted in our receiving the following information. The personality or control in communication with us purported to be that of a Saxon soldier who had died fighting for King Henry II. On my expressing surprise that a Saxon should have been defending a Norman king, he maintained that his account of himself was nevertheless true. He had fallen in the neighborhood of the abbey and had been buried without any prayer being said over his body, and although, like most people, he had been neither very good nor very bad, and was not unhappy in his present state, he would be infinitely easier if a mass could be said for him. When I remarked that the abbey, near by which he said he had been buried, did not exist in the time of Henry II, he replied that there had been an earlier abbey on the same spot, a statement which I was not in position to dispute. I then asked how it was that after the lapse of many hundred years he should apply for assistance to a couple of Anglicans whose church did not include prayers for the dead among its doctrines. He answered that he had frequently, but without success, tried to communicate with his descendants and others, that the difference of religion did not affect the question, and that he would be most grateful if we would have a mass said for him. This we promised to do, whereupon he thanked us and bade us good night. My wife's arm was released from the control, and we went home to bed greatly interested but not in the least excited. Either that night or the following morning I wrote to an old friend of mine, Father A, and without going into details told him that as a result of a strange experience I was anxious to see him in order to arrange, if possible, for masses to be said for the repose of his soul. I added that I was uncertain whether his church would allow such masses when there was no means of identifying the person for whom they were to be said. We visited the abbey again in the daytime, but nothing unusual took place. But that night the same phenomena occurred. My wife's arm was at once controlled, and a message was given expressing gratitude for what we had done. I asked if we could be of any further help, but was assured that if 2 masses could be said, the spirit would never trouble us again. The control then ceased, and we went home. On reaching London a few days later, and referring to Green's history, I found that the amalgamation between Saxons and Normans had made great progress by Henry II's reign, and indeed that the Saxons, having accepted their foreign kings, were the more loyal of the 2 races, frequently supporting the monarch against his turbulent barons. Presently I heard from Father A, giving me an appointment and adding that his church gave full power to the priesthood to say masses for the unknown departed. I told him the whole story, which greatly interested him, and he promised to say 4 masses for the troubled spirit of the Saxon soldier. In the following year he died. I did not expect to hear anything more of our friend at Tintern, but 10 years later, in 1905, he gave us the following reminder of his existence. One evening in November of that year, having several friends to dinner who were interested in so-called spiritualistic phenomena, we agreed to have a sitting round the table. About 7 people were present, among them 2 ladies, known to be possessed of remarkable psychic powers. One of them was an intimate friend, the other we had met that evening for the first time. We sat down. It was not quite dark, for a fire was burning. At first, a number of messages from acquaintances who had passed away were delivered in the usual way by raps or the tilting of the table, until the power seemed to be exhausted and the manifestation ceased. Thereupon our new acquaintance grew impatient and pressed with some heat for further messages to be given. My wife protested, pointing out that we should not try to force the power. Whatever it might be, it should be treated with courtesy. The table immediately tilted towards her and slowly rapped out the words, "Very many thanks." We thought she was being thanked for her remonstrance, but the taps continued. The whole message was, "Very many thanks for the masses said." Afterwards, the two psychic ladies who were sitting on either side of my wife said that they had seen standing behind her the bearded figure of a handsome middle-aged man, dressed in strange, close-fitting clothes of a gray material. Some years before, we had told our story to one of the two ladies, but it was not known to anyone else in the room. Labedoyere's Doom. The story appeared in the January number of Fraser's Magazine, 1882. The author was Canon Malcolm MacCall, a well-known priest with whom Lord Halifax was personally acquainted. Of all Napoleon's victories, the Battle of Marengo is considered by military critics to have been, on the whole, the most brilliant in conception that he ever fought, as it certainly was one of the most fruitful in results. Yet, after all, it may be said to have been won by a fluke. The passage of the Alps by the First Council took the ever unready Austrians completely by surprise. Their forces were scattered among the fortresses of Lombardy and Piedmont, and their generals were disconcerted by the sudden apparition of Napoleon, and by the unexpected tactics which he pursued. Messina, with a small French and Cisalpine garrison, was shut up in Genoa by an Austrian army and blockading squadron. Both he and the Austrians expected that Napoleon would march to the relief of the besieged men, while the Austrian commander-in-chief, the Baron de Melas, was in Turin, hurriedly collecting his forces. But instead of marching on Genoa, Napoleon turned to the east and placed his army between the Austrians and their own fortresses. He entered Milan and seized the passages of the Po and the Adda without firing a shot. Piacenza fell an easy prey, and in a few days Melas was completely cut off from his communications north of the Po. The Austrian commander was thus reduced to the dilemma of cutting his way through the French lines or making his escape to Genoa, Messina having in the interval surrendered on condition of being allowed to retire with all his garrison. The besieging force, thus being released from Genoa, hastened to join Baron de Melas at Alexandria. Even then the Austrians could only muster 30,000 men out of the 80,000 which they had foolishly scattered in weak detachments all over Lombardy. Napoleon, whose force was also about 30,000, had his center halfway between Piacenza and Alessandria. He made sure that Melas would retreat rapidly on Genoa, and dispatched accordingly the divisions of Desaix and Monier to intercept him. But Melas did not retreat. He made up his mind to give Napoleon battle, and quietly awaited his approach at Alessandria. As soon as he discovered the mistake which Napoleon had made, he issued from his stronghold and flung his whole force against the weakened French line, first at Montebello and then at Marengo. After 7 hours fighting, the French, in spite of Napoleon's exertions and Murat's brilliant charges, in spite also of the heroic stand made by the grenadiers of the Consular Guard, were driven into a narrow defile where they were exposed to the Austrian artillery and almost surrounded by the Austrian infantry and cavalry. Having made his dispositions and secured, as he thought, his prey, the Austrian commander returned into Alessandria to take a little rest before summoning the French to surrender. So certain did he feel as to the issue of the battle that he sent out dispatches announcing a victory. Meanwhile, however, the sound of the cannonade behind them had reached the ears of Desaix and Monier, and caused them to hurry back to Marengo. There they met a multitude of panic-stricken French fugitives, who declared that the battle was lost. "Then we will win another," gaily replied Desaix. The fugitives immediately turned back with him. The French, thus reinforced, renewed the fight, and the Austrians, completely off their guard, were thrown into confusion by the suddenness of the onset, and Murat completely overthrew their impetuous charges. The victory was dearly bought by the death of Desaix, but the prize which it yielded was magnificent. The Baron de Melas, utterly stupefied by so great a disaster after so signal a victory, sued for a truce, and agreed to purchase it by the surrender of Genoa and all the fortresses of Lombardy and Piedmont. Probably he had no alternative, for he was completely severed from his communications, and his army was broken and demoralized. The Battle of Marengo was thus a turning point in Napoleon's career. The fortunate return of Desaix at the critical moment saved the First Council from surrender or death. What a change in the map and history of Europe those few hours made! Napoleon knew well the importance of securing to himself, in the estimation of the French, the sole credit of the victory of Marengo. He collected and destroyed every document which told the true story of the battle, and wrote his own account of it in a dispatch, which ascribed all the glory of victory and its stupendous consequences to his own genius and courage. To possess the French mind with his own story of Marengo was in fact to establish his ascendancy beyond the reach of all competitors. How was this to be accomplished? It did not take Napoleon long to decide that question. He had a favorite young aide de camp, Labedoyere by name, on whose zeal and devotion he could thoroughly rely. To him he entrusted the task of bearing the Napoleonic version of the Battle of Marengo to Paris. Relays of fresh horses were ordered along the road, and Labedoyere was directed to ride by way of Genoa and the Riviera de Ponente, and proclaim along the coastline the last splendid achievement of the First Consul's genius. The Battle of Marengo was fought on June 14, 1800, and on the morning of the following day young Labedoyere started for Paris. His ride as far as Avignon took him through some of the most splendid scenery in Europe, but he had little time to admire it. His orders were to have Napoleon's dispatch published in extenso in Paris within 9 days of his parting from the First Council, and to communicate a summary of its contents to the proper authorities in the principal places en route. This involved desperately hard riding. From Genoa to Nice the young aide de camp only paused once, except for the purpose of refreshment and changing horses, and that one pause nearly cost him his life. The shadows of evening were fading as he passed through Mentone, and before he had reached the summit of the mountain that separates Mentone from Nice, the light of day had completely vanished. A bend of the road brought him in sudden view of the sea, lying far beneath him and gleaming tremulously in the light of the moon and stars. An ejaculation of delight escaped from his lips, and he stopped to contemplate the scene. His reverie was rudely and almost fatally broken. His horse took fright at something and made a violent bound, which threw its rider clean out of the saddle and over the parapet. With no worse injury than some superficial scratches, he regained the road, where he found his horse standing quietly, though still trembling with fright. On the morning of June 23rd, Labedoyere reached Paris. He had accomplished his long ride well within the prescribed time. As he passed Notre Dame about 8 o'clock in the morning, the door of the cathedral was open, and the interior looked cool and refreshing, in striking contrast with the glare of the streets and the aching of his tired limbs. Seized by a sudden impulse to refresh himself in the coolness, and at the same time to return thanks to God for the safe accomplishment of his journey, he dismounted, handed the bridle of his horse to a bystander, and entered the church with his dispatch bag slung over his shoulder. He was, as far as he could see, the only occupant, but after a while a priest came out of the sacristy and began to say mass at one of the side altars. He was a venerable-looking old man with scanty locks of white hair falling almost down to his shoulders. In figure he was tall and thin, but the most striking part of his person was his face. It was handsome and noble, but wore an expression of such hopeless yet unrepining sorrow as to impress Labedoyere with a vague feeling of mingled sympathy and terror. The old man's pensive grey eyes, too, when they turned in the direction of Labedoyere, seemed to be gazing so intently at something beyond that the young aide-de-camp could not help looking instinctively behind them. But there was nothing but the empty floor and the dead wall of the cathedral, and the voice of the priest, even the low tone in which he said mass, had a weird, musical, pathetic wail in it. Altogether, Labedoyere felt fascinated, whether by attraction or repulsion he could hardly tell. Meanwhile the priest, having administered the sacrament to himself, looked round to see if there were any intending communicants present. Labedoyere was the only person in the church, and he, still under the spell of those sad grey eyes, moved, half mechanically, towards the altar, knelt down in front of the old priest, and received the sacrament. Then, just as he was rising to return to his seat, the old man whispered in his ear, "Young man, the soldier's calling is not favorable, in these days, especially to the vocation of a Christian. All the more do I rejoice that the darts of temptation to which a soldier's life is so perilously exposed have thus far glanced scatheless from your shield of faith and purity." As he said this, a look of great pain flitted across the old man's face, but he continued, I have been struck with your simple faith and unaffected devotion, qualities, alas, too rare nowadays in men of your years and calling. Is there anything I can do for you? For I should like to serve you. Labedoyere, taken utterly aback, stammered out, "No, there is nothing." But instantly observing the priest's disappointed look, and being unwilling to hurt his feelings, he asked, "But what do you mean? What kind of service do you speak of?" "I have the gift of foretelling future events," said the old man. "Is there anything you would like to know as to your future life? Any danger which timely knowledge might avert? Any obstacle in the way of legitimate desire which I might help you to remove?" Labedoyere, more for the sake of anything than from any other cause, answered, "Well, if you can really see the future, will you tell me how long I have to live?" All this time the old man's eyes had a fixed, absent, anxious look, as if watching for some expected apparition. On hearing Labedoyere's question, he started, and waved his arms violently as if repelling some advancing object, while at the same time his face betokened extreme terror. In a moment, however, he recovered his composure, and said to Labedoyere, in a slightly agitated tone of voice, "I wish you had not asked me that question, and yet perhaps it is best as it is. Yes, yes, no doubt you have been sent to me for the very purpose of receiving this warning. You wish to know how long you have to live. I am commissioned to tell you that on this day 12th month at midnight you will die. And now, my son, since this is a danger which no foresight can avert, you must prepare yourself to meet it. You think me cruel?" This was an answer to a look, half of terror, half of reproach, on the face of Labedoyere. "No, my son. The message you have received through me has been sent to you in love. Think how many are called suddenly out of this life without a moment's preparation. Not that I would have you suppose that sudden death is necessarily in itself an evil, or that a short warning of the day and hour of one's death is necessarily in itself a blessing. Warning of death is a distinct disadvantage to a being on probation unless it works a fundamental change, not simply in his conduct but in his principles and motives. The best preparation for death is diligence in the task allotted to us. Go home, therefore, my son, and remember this day 12th month at midnight. But in the meantime, neglect not the duties of your daily life." The old priest then finished the service somewhat hurriedly and disappeared into the sacristy. Labedoyere remained kneeling on the altar steps, dazed and stupefied. The disappearance of the priest recalled him to himself. He rose and moved slowly to the seat where he had left his cap and dispatch bag. Kneeling down, he buried his face in his hands and made an effort to recall his wandering thoughts, and assure himself that it was not all a dream. Satisfied on that point, he next tried to persuade himself that the old priest was crazed, and had mistaken the aberration of an eccentric imagination for the inspiration of a divine message. But there was that in the voice, look, and manner of the old man which would not square with this theory, something which Labedoyere felt, though he could not quite explain it, and of which he could not shake off the impression. He had a vivid presentiment that it would be perilous to disregard the warning so mysteriously given. "After all," he said, "my prudent course is to assume that the doom just pronounced at me will be fulfilled. Let me see, I have a year before me. If the old man spoke truth, I need not fear death in that interval. That at least is some compensation. I will divide my year into two equal portions. The first half I shall devote to seeing what I can of life, the life of the great city, the life of women and children, of gaiety and brightness, as well as of soldiers hacking each other to pieces for the sake of glory. But I should like to see the old prince once more. I must get his address, for he may be of use to me." But the old priest had left the church, and Labedoyere could not discover anything about him, not even his name. The verger said he was a stranger who had asked for an altar at which to say his mass, and no one knew whence he had come or whither he had gone. Labedoyere rode straight to his apartment not far from Notre Dame. After breakfast and a short nap, he sallied out to arrange for the publication of Napoleon's dispatch on the morrow. His next step was to resign his commission and leave the army. The Parisians have always shown a wonderful clarity in passing from the deepest despondency to the utmost gaiety. At this period Paris was just emerging out of the gloom and agony of the Reign of Terror. It was but 6 years previously that Robespierre had closed his career on the scaffold to which he had sent so many others. But all that was forgotten in the buoyancy of spirits caused by the wonderful success of the arms of France across the Alps and beyond the Rhine. Paris was enriched by the spoils and forced contributions of the conquered. She was thus wealthy and gay and proud when Labedoyere plunged into the vortex of her pleasures. For a season he had joined them with all the zest of inexperienced youth. The image of the old priest soon vanished from his memory, and with it the predicted doom. Presently, however, they returned with added and tragic force. Labedoyere, as was natural to a man of his age and susceptible temperament, had fallen in love. Whether it was natural that he should have fallen in love with a woman considerably older than himself, by no means handsome, and remarkable for nothing in particular except an extremely shrewd intellect, a caustic wit, a diminutive body, and a splendid head of hair, is more than I can tell. She conquered Labedoyere through his vanity, of which he had a considerable bump. Within 3 weeks of his first meeting Mademoiselle Oudinot, he was as helpless in her toils as Samson in the arms of Delilah, when the locks of his strength were shorn. She was the orphan daughter and only child of a worthy butcher, who, from many humble beginnings, had amassed a large fortune by means of army contracts. Uneducated himself, he had bestowed on his daughter the best education that money could purchase. Her wealth, her tact, her wit, and talent for conversation had made a sort of reputation for her. Their company was sought at the tables of even the most exclusive houses, for it had become known that any party at which Mademoiselle Oudinot was a guest would at least not be a dull one. On enjoying her social success, she knew that the admiration which she extorted was hollow, and that the proud ladies who sought her company did so from the same motives for which they hired their cook, to make their dinners attractive. Some of them hated her cordially, for she had a rare gift for impromptu epigram, and her shafts were always barbed and found their mark. No woman offended her without paying the penalty of being made the laughing stock of every salon in Paris for the next few days. What Mademoiselle Dinette wanted was not love, but admiration. She was clever enough to know that her wit and brilliance could not secure, to the end of the chapter, the homage that was now paid her. It was only in and not of the society in which she mingled. The butcher's daughter must merge her name in that of some ancient house. She had formed this resolution about the time she met Labedoyere. He was poor, though possessing a sufficient income for a bachelor, and he was noble. She was plebeian but rich, and sought after in society. Were they not made for each other? Paris was hankering for the pageantry of a court, and there were signs that ere long its wish would be gratified. The wife of citizen Labedoyere would then be the Marquis de Labedoyere. The young man, too, was just then one of the lions of the city. His name had been mentioned more than once in dispatches for conspicuous gallantry, and he was known to be a special favorite with the First Consul. Nor was he at all injured in the public estimation by the resignation of his commission. It was believed that he had a secret mission in Paris under the orders of Bonaparte, and would soon receive some important appointment. In every way young Labrador was a prize well worth hunting down. Nor did the hunt last long. The inexperienced young soldier fell an easy prey to the artful flattery of a woman whom all the men admired and all the women feared. But his engagement was succeeded within a few weeks by serious misgivings as to the wisdom of his choice. His fiancée made the mistake of imagining that a conquest so easily won could be as easily maintained. Labedoyere soon woke to the consciousness that he had foolishly allowed himself to be made the tool of a designing woman. But what was he to do? He was an honorable man, and Mademoiselle Dinae took good care to give him no pretext for quarreling with her. As his coolness increased, so did her devotion to him. Aid came at last in an unexpected way. The First Consul saw the blunder the Republic had made in arraying against itself all the religious sentiment of France, and lost no time in permitting the churches to be opened again for the worship of God. One Sunday evening Labrador chanced to pass the open door of a little church in a by-street in the Quartier Latin. He went in and found a crowded congregation listening with uplifted faces to an impassioned sermon by a preacher whom Labrador could not see from the place where he was standing, but whose voice instantly arrested his attention. The preacher was finishing, and his words fixed themselves so indelibly in Labedoyre's memory that when he went home he had no difficulty in reproducing them in his diary. The text was, "Every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment." Nothing, the preacher warned his hearers, that was spoken was ever lost. It remained implanted on the tablets of the memory, and by it a man would one day be judged. The preacher finished and then descended among the people to collect his alms. He was no other than the old priest of Notre Dame. His eyes and Labedoyre's met, and as the latter bent forward to drop a coin into the bag, the priest whispered in his ear, "Remember midnight on the 23rd of next June." He then passed on. When the service was over and the congregation had dispersed, Labedoyere made his way to the vestry, where he found the old priest on the point of departure. He paused on seeing the young man, but kept his hold on the handle of the door, as if impatient to be off. After a hurried apology for his intrusion, Labedoyere begged to be permitted to call on the priest. "I have no home," replied the old man, "and my time is not my own. Today I am here, tomorrow gone, and I know not from hour to hour whither I may be sent by him whose unworthy servant I am. I cannot therefore make appointments, because I can never be certain of being allowed to keep them." Labedoyere asked that at least he might be told his name. "I am dead to the world," said the man, and his voice resumed that weird wail and his eyes that distant look, which Labedoyere remembered so well before the altar of Notre Dame. "In religion I am known as Brother Antonio. Ask me no more questions. I have already delivered my message, and I have no commission to satisfy an idle curiosity. Remember the 23rd of June at midnight. Time is short, eternity is long." The old priest, bowing courteously, passed out, closing the door behind him. Next day Labedoyere sought an interview with Mademoiselle Odinette. A few days ago he would have welcomed any pretext for breaking off his engagement. Now, with this reminder of his doom, he could tell his justice quite truthfully that for her own sake she must be released from her engagement. She, of course, would scarcely listen to him, and rallied him on the folly of believing the ravings of a crack-brained old priest. When raillery failed, she tried tears, but Labedoyere was inexorable, cut short the scene by abruptly taking his leave. It was the first time that Mademoiselle Dinette had found herself jilted by a man, and something in Labedoyre's manner told her that he had found her out. A woman either loves or hates, says the Roman proverb. There is nothing in between. With her, love had been changed to hate. "I will anticipate the priest's prediction," she told herself, "and save fate the trouble of fulfilling her decree on the 23rd of June." Accordingly, she sent a note to one of her rejected lovers, whom she had still kept dancing attendance on her, even after her engagement to Labedoyere. He was a young man of good family, shady character, broken fortune, and expensive taste, to whom an alliance with a rich heiress was of prime importance. He had been hopeful of success, until Labedoyere crossed his path and carried off his prize. Naturally, therefore, his feelings towards his rival were far from benevolent. Equally naturally, this fact was not hidden from Mademoiselle Dinette. But an even greater recommendation in her eyes was the circumstance that Picard was reputed one of the best swordsmen in Paris. It was easy to give him a version of her quarrel with Labedoyere, which at once portrayed herself as an innocent victim and served to revive the hopes of her old suitor. Picard took in the situation at a glance. If only he could get rid of his rival, his ambition would be realized. He left the lady's presence in great glee, and soon found an opportunity of forcing a quarrel upon Labedoyere. A sneering insinuation at an evening party in the other's hearing that a lack of courage had led him to leave the army was enough. Labedoyere was also a dexterous swordsman, but out of practice in spirits. Two great disadvantages, where quickness of eye and strength and suppleness of wrist are so requisite. His antagonist, on the other hand, was in daily practice, and his spirits rose. Probably, however, Labedoyere's depression was of great service to him on this occasion. He had become so persuaded of the fulfillment of his doom on the 23rd of the following June that he had come to regard his own death before that date as an impossibility. He knew of his opponent's skill of fence, though he had never witnessed it, and he had no mean opinion of his own. So, believing in his immunity, he appeared on the ground with his head as cool as if he were sitting down to a game of chess. Picard's head was not nearly so cool. and he made moreover the fatal mistake of despising his adversary. A few passes, however, showed him that he would need all his skill and nerve. In fact, they were so evenly matched that after fighting for 10 minutes without either touching the other, by mutual consent they paused to rest. On renewing the contest, they fought for some time without advantage to either side, until Picard lost patience, and attempting to pass Labedoyere's guard with a rapid thrust, his foot slipped on the dewy grass, the point of his sword flew up, and he fell heavily forward, transfixing himself and his opponent's weapon. The wound was fatal, and before Labedoyere fully realized what had happened, he was gazing horror-struck on the corpse of his foe. Thrusting his reddened blade into the ground, he broke it, and as he did so, through the stillness of the morning air, a well-remembered voice uttered in low but clear tones, "We shall meet at midnight on the 23rd of next June." The voice sent a chill to Labedoyere's heart. He rushed in the direction from which it had seemed to come. A high hedge separated the field where the deal took place from the road, which at a distance of some 200 yards entered a dense wood, and just as Labedoyere looked over the hedge he saw a tall, dark, slim figure with flowing white locks disappearing into the wood. Hastily dressing himself and leaving the body of his late foe with the seconds and surgeon, Labedoyere pursued the mysterious priest but failed to overtake him, which is not surprising since the wood was intersected by many paths and Labedoyere evidently missed the right one. He now resolved to leave Paris and await his doom elsewhere. He would have liked to rejoin the army, but that was impossible. He had deeply offended the First Consul by retiring, and Napoleon was not the man to forgive an offense of that kind. In the end, he made up his mind to go to Palermo, where he knew he would receive a warm welcome from the Marchino San Giuliano, whose acquaintance he had made in Italy, and whose father, the Marchese, had large estates on the island. Labedoyere arrived in Palermo on a bright afternoon at the beginning of April. At the Palazzo San Giuliano he found all the family out, but the servant told him that he would probably meet the Marchesino in the public gardens by the roadstead. There, among a throng of loungers, Labedoyere found his friend and his family, who greeted the young Frenchman with genuine hospitality. With them he now spent some delightful weeks, first at Palermo and afterwards at their villa near Taormina. About 3 weeks after his arrival at Taormina, Labedoyere made a solitary excursion to the marble quarries on Monte Zerretto. Returning, he missed his way and found himself at nightfall skirting the rocky peak of Lapa. Then he knew where he was, for he could see Taormina not far off. That moment, however, he was startled by the sound of a shot fired close above him, while at the same time a gruff voice cried, "Bocca a terra!" He had been in Sicily long enough to know that he must throw himself face forward on the ground and let the brigands seize him, on pain of being instantly shot. 6 guns were pointing at him from a distance of about 10 yards, but since for another month he bore a charmed life, he disregarded the challenge and rushed down the mountain. The brigands did not fire, and he was beginning to think he had escaped them when he was thrown violently to the ground. A powerful bloodhound was standing over him, and before he could recover himself the brigands were on him and overpowered him. For some hours they led him blindfolded over the mountains. When they unbandaged his eyes, it was quite dark, and he had no idea where he was. Toward the following afternoon the band arrived with their captive at a cave, which was evidently their lair, and where they had tolerably comfortable quarters. They set food and wine before their prisoner, who partook of them with a sharpened appetite. He was then told to write a note to the Marchese demanding a handsome ransom, on receipt of which by the brigands he would be conducted in safety to the neighborhood of Taormina. In vain Labedoyere explained that he had no claim whatever on the generosity of the Marchese. In vain he defied his captors to shoot him. The chief brigand told them in the blandest tones that they never shot a captive. After the ransom became due, they sent a piece of his body at intervals, while life lasted, to quicken the zeal of his family and friends. Labedoyere shuddered. Death he could face, but not piecemeal mutilation. He wrote the note to the Marchese, and awaited the issue with all the stoicism at his command. During the day the band was augmented by the arrival of 4 more brigands, who had been on an unsuccessful expedition in another direction. At first Labedoyere took no particular notice of the new arrivals, but presently he was conscious of being an object of curiosity to one of them, whose eyes he found steadily fixed on him whenever he looked in that direction. He had a feeling that he had seen the man before, and all at once it flashed on him that the new arrival was a Genoese soldier who had been badly wounded on the field of Areola. Labedoyere had happened to be passing just as the wounded man was about to be thrown into a pit with the dead bodies, and finding that his pulse was still beating, had had him carried to his tent. Thanks to Labedoyere, the man recovered and was set at liberty. He now contrived to slip into his benefactor's hands a paper on which were scrawled the words, "I shall be one of your guard tonight, and will help you to escape, but beware of the hound." So it fell out. During the afternoon the chief went off with a band, leaving 2 men, of whom the Genoese was one, to guard the prisoner. In the course of the night the other man fell fast asleep. The Genoese proposed to kill him, but Labedoyere would not consent. He agreed, however, that they should bind and gag the sleeping brigand and then make their escape. The man was soon overpowered, and the 2 fugitives fled. It was lucky for Labedoyere that he was not alone, as he had not the least idea which way to turn on leaving the cave. His companion, however, knew the way to Taormina, and they hurried as fast as their feet could carry them, in the hope of being beyond the reach of capture by daybreak. Whenever they came to a stream, they waded through it for a considerable distance, in order to throw the hound off the scent in the event of their being pursued. Towards daybreak they were following the course of a wide but shallow mountain stream, whose banks were covered with brushwood, when the quick ear of the Genoese caught in the distance the deep baying of the bloodhound. Quickly they waded into a rock covered with scrub, where they hid themselves, dripping as they were. The hound was then so close that they could see the swaying of the bushes on the bank of the stream as he made his way through them. At length he reached the spot at which they had entered the water, ran up and down the bank, and plunged once or twice uncertainly into the stream. He had lost the scent, and after a while stood still and bayed aloud his disappointment. Half an hour later the chief and 4 of the brigands arrived. They searched diligently both sides of the stream, passing and repassing within a few yards of the men for whom they were searching. Fortunately it never occurred to them to visit the rock, and at last, cursing the dog, they gave up the chase. The fugitives stayed in hiding until it was quite dark, and then resuming their flight arrived in the early mornings at the Villa San Juano. Here Labedoyere was greeted as one risen from the dead. The Marchese had sent for his banker for the ransom money, but that was no longer necessary. The mail had arrived during Labedoyere's absence, and among his letters he found to his surprise one from the old priest, summoning him to Paris at once. Despite the dissuasions of his friends, he started the following day, taking the Genoese ex-brigand with him. On arrival in Paris he went without delay to the address which the priest had given him, but found the old man had gone out of town. He had, however, left a note behind, telling Labedoyere he would call upon him at midnight on the 23rd of June. It was now the 17th. Labedoyere accordingly invited 2 of his closest friends to dine with him on the 23rd, adding in a postscript that they would oblige him by retiring at 10 o'clock. The day arrived. At 10 Labedoyere was left alone, as he thought. He sat in an armchair and began to read Pascal's Pensées, with occasional glances at the clock on the mantelpiece opposite. 11 struck, and he fancied that a numbness was creeping over him. Telling himself that it was only nervousness, he tried to go on reading. 11:30 struck, and he felt his pulse, which was certainly slower than it should be. 12:15, and he closed his book and sat with his eyes fixed on the clock and a finger on his pulse. There was no doubt now it had almost stopped. A deadly chill settled on his body. Then the great clock of Notre Dame began to toll out the hour of midnight, and as the echo of the last stroke of the hammer was dying away, he fell back in his chair half unconscious. How long he remained in that state we know, for a pair of keen eyes were earnestly watching him, and before life had quite departed, and while he hovered, as it were, in the borderland of this world and the next, a heavy hand fell upon his shoulder, and a hollow voice, as from the tomb, spoke in his ear. "Awake, for I am going to shut up the church." Labedoyere opened his eyes slowly and saw standing before him, key in hand, the beadle of Notre Dame.